Hi, Father Ian Van Heusen here. So what I want to get at in today's video is talk about, can we attend gay weddings? But really, to have this conversation, we got to kind of flesh things out and have a little bit of a deeper conversation and get back to some principles that are a rich part of the Catholic tradition. So one of the ideas I've been playing with a lot, and is an idea that came from my sister. She had an insight. She said, in our contemporary society, one virtue that's profoundly lacking often is the virtue of justice. So what do we mean by the virtue of justice? St. Thomas Aquinas would define justice in this way. He would say, justice is a habit whereby a man renders to each one his due by a constant and perpetual will. So justice is a sense that we rendered in our relationships a certain fairness, a certain equity. I think what we've seen, particularly in the church world, is where there's not the rule of law, where there's not a profound sense of justice, what happens is we have a kind of tyranny of personal opinion which emerges. Well, what do I mean by this? So when there's not clear procedures and there's not a clear system that treats everyone fairly, what often happens is we come into situations and how people respond and how they either allow or don't permit us to do what we want, whether they bind or loose us in one direction or another. What really is the thrust of it is, how do they feel in the moment, or how do they feel about us? I think people are very frustrated, particularly in parishes, because we can see that sometimes parishes will have a kind of certain hypocrisy. They may have strict standards for baptism, which go beyond canon law, but also we've seen situations where priests will be willing to bend those same rules for people just simply because they like them. Now, the rule of canon law and the rule of law in the church is something incredibly important. I think when it's lacking a lot of times, instead, like I said before, we get this tyranny of personal opinion. So that's the context, the virtue of justice, trying to discover what is just. Because there's kind of two extremes a lot of times in contemporary American society, particularly in the American church. On one hand, there's a kind of laxist extreme, which is, hey, we don't need law, we don't need rules, just do what makes you feel good. And again, when that's in play, instead of the rule of law dictating what is just, instead it comes down to personal opinion. How do I feel about the person? What do I think of the person? Versus a kind of fair principle that I can be just with somebody who I don't even like. The other extreme is we see sometimes people in their zeal that they want to help people to know Jesus, and maybe a misguided zeal, they go beyond the law. They impose obligations. They make Catholicism seem a lot stricter than it actually is. And the gay wedding issue is one of these issues that I think is incredibly important test case that can kind of draw out some of these principles. So the first thing I want to get into, the first point with this, is I want to couch things and kind of bring things to St. Alphonsus Ligouri's theology. I'm going to draw a few citations from his work on moral theology, and I'm going to kind of flesh it out a little bit. So one of the first point is there's not a strict law that prohibits the lay faithful from attending a gay wedding. Now that doesn't come from St. Alphonsus Ligouri, but it's clear right now, every source, I've double checked this, I've talked with moral theologians, I've talked with canon lawyers, there's not a strict law that prevents people from attending a gay wedding. Now that doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all, but the first principle we need to get into that St. Alphonsus Ligouri talks about is a doubtful law does not create a certain obligation. So in this regards, where there's not a clear law, there won't be a clear obligation. So on page 77, I should probably have had the citation ready, but it's a recent book of his collected works, Moral Theology, Volume 1, Volume 2. This is page 77. Therefore, with the principle handed down by St. Thomas posited, sufficiently proved above, namely, that no one is bound by some precept except through the medium of knowledge of that precept, which is the same as to say, an uncertain law cannot induce a certain obligation. Necessarily, it is elected to be morally certain, because where two opinions of equal weight coincide, there is no obligation to follow the safer. So, one of the ideas that St. Alphonsus Ligouri in his time was there was a debate between probabilism and probabilism. I mispronounced that, whatever. But anyways, there was a debate at that time, and the views that were held was that the question was how to weigh what they would call probable opinions. So there's not a clear obligation by the law, we need to look at the differences in probable opinions. And I'm going to kind of give you some examples to kind of guide in this question of, can I attend a gay wedding? So another key feature for the sake of justice and for law is, for a law to be binding, it has to be promulgated by rightful authority. So there is a sense that a bishop or a diocese could promulgate a law saying that the lay faithful in that diocese can attend gay weddings, but there's not any law that prohibits it at this point. So I want to kind of get it now into some cases to kind of draw out a circumstance in which I believe it would be a probable opinion that's worth considering that we could attend a gay wedding, and then one in which we cannot attend a gay wedding. And we can just kind of continue this conversation on social media as you're kind of seeing these. The first one was, these are two cases I received. I received a case of a woman. She was concerned about her daughter. She wanted to go to the wedding of her daughter, or she didn't necessarily know if she wanted to go. She was trying to weigh her options. And she had told her daughter that she disagreed with her being married to another woman, that she felt that the church is teaching, which is true, that it's not a valid marriage and that she should consider chastity. And so she had that conversation with her daughter. But some of the circumstances of the situation was that the daughter was isolating herself from the rest of her family. She had slowly been more and more isolated. She didn't have a whole lot of friends. There weren't going to be a whole lot of people at the wedding. It was just going to be a justice of the peace wedding with maybe a small reception afterwards. So the mother was concerned that if she didn't go to the wedding and at least have that connection that day, she was never going to see her again. So this was a major concern. So what I talked with her about was, I said, I think in this case, there is the possibility that she could go to the wedding. Because what I think you have to weigh in the case of whether we should go to a gay wedding or not is, on one hand, there's the possibility of scandal. So scandal, that we lead other people into sin, that we make it seem like we don't believe the church teachings or we undermine the church teaching. On the other hand, the other extreme I think we need to weigh is the question of evangelization. So with the question of evangelization, when we have these relationships and we open the door for conversation, a lot of times it can be very hard to proclaim Jesus Christ and to correct sinners if we don't have that relationship and we literally can't get a hold of them, or we can't have a conversation with them. So sometimes evangelization requires that we be patient with people and we try to look for the opportunity to proclaim Jesus Christ and to help people to come to know the truth. So for the sake of evangelization in that relationship, I felt like it would be okay for her to attend the gay wedding. Nobody in the community would know about it. It wasn't going to be a big wedding. It wasn't going to be publicly broadcasted. So I felt like it was okay in that situation. Now, there's another case where I felt like it would not be prudent to attend a gay wedding, which was a prominent member of our community at one of my parishes. They were debating attending the wedding of a nephew. And this wedding was going to be a much bigger deal. The nephew was doing quite well. He had a lot of friends. A lot of family members were going to be there. And these people, this particular couple, were known as being pillars of the community. They were recognized as being very involved both with their church and with their family. So for them to attend the gay wedding, I felt like the possibility of scandal and misunderstanding outweighed the possibility of evangelization. So I asked them to consider maybe going to the reception versus the wedding, or maybe declining altogether. So you see kind of how we weigh probable opinions. Remember, when it comes to virtuous activities, when it comes to activities, St. Thomas Aquinas would to say there's the action, there's the intent, and then there's the circumstances. And often with these difficult cases, we have to weigh the different circumstances. So that's purely a legal way of looking at it. But now I want to go a little bit deeper. So as I kind of see it, I see St. Alphonsus Ligouri being a great piggyback to then combine also with St. Ignatius of Loyola, and to really look at this holistically. So we start with the law. What does the law say? What are the legal principles? What does casuistry say? What does moral theology say? But then we want to go to the deeper question, what is God calling me to do? So in a case like this, with gay weddings, where we don't have a clear obligation that we're not able to go. Now, actually, let me back up for a second before I get into that. For church employees and for priests, I think it's inappropriate to go to gay weddings. So I think for those folks, I think there would be policies in place that because of the public nature of their job, that it would go against the church. But for everybody else, since there's not a clear obligation, there's a certain amount of discernment that is possible. So weighing the possibility of scandal also weighing the possibility of evangelization, but asking a deeper principle. What does the Lord want me to do? Practicing that ongoing discernment. So when we move from the legalistic and the casuistry, then what we need to look at is the rules of discernment. We need to take it to prayer. We need to reflect on things and try to look for the work of the Holy Spirit. What is God calling us to do? And so for that, I think we really need to rely on St. Ignatius and the whole tradition of ongoing discernment and what he gives us about decision making. So that's what I would leave you with. This has been kind of a test case of a spirituality of decision making that I want to promote. Starting with the law, starting with the principle of justice, and then moving to discernment depending on the case. Combining both an understanding of obeying God's law, but also recognizing that in difficult circumstances or in difficult situations, recognizing the flexibility within the law that frees us to be creative in a certain regards, depending on the circumstances. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk. This is Father Ian Van Heusen, and let us know what you think. The full talk's going to be on YouTube, so you're probably watching this on YouTube, this last part. Comment in the section, do you disagree or agree? If you can find other citations, anything, feel free to poke holes in this is an ongoing process. I want to kind of have this ongoing conversation on social media. So thanks for listening. God bless.